This is going to be the panel on monsters around medieval worlds. And I will, other than that, hand the floor over to Liam, who is going to be session sharing for this. Liam and other panelists, please come and take the seat spots up here, and then you will be broadcast modable. Liam, over to you.
Yes, and I'm looking for, where's my third panelist here? There we go. Hi, guys. So, cool. Yeah, nice. I guess good morning, afternoon, and late night to assorted members of our audience. This will be the Monsters Around Medieval Worlds panel, in which we will have two, not three panelists at present, talking about monsters and cultural and historical specificities of their areas. And I guess before we jump right into that, because I have the pleasure of having the first slot, a huge thank you to James, of course, for organizing all of this, because it's an incredible thing that he does every year out of a combined nerdiness and passion, which is kind of what brings us all together here, which is awesome. And a secondary thank you, of course, to Professor Andrews from University of Vienna for funding this space, even if she could not come because she has her own monsters to deal with this weekend. So we'll have two 10 to 15 minute talks and then open it up for both discussion between the panelists and questions from everyone to kind of make it a sizable round table. So the panelists that we have here, and I apologize in advance if I butcher names of either you guys or the books, but we have Tineke D'Haeseleer, who is trained as a sinologist at Leuven University and got her PhD in medieval Chinese history at Cambridge in 2012. For 2 decades, she taught classical Chinese and East Asian history in the UK, the Netherlands, and the States. And she is the editor of the textbook that she mentioned, so track that down the line. And also cool that she did an episode of the BBC You're Dead to Me podcast with Greg Jenner on the Tang Dynasty, which you can track down wherever you track such things down. And we've also got with us here Rebecca Merkelbach, assistant professor of Old Norse Icelandic Studies at Tübingen in Germany, who has published on a number of subjects, paranormal and monstrous in medieval Icelandic literature, including the book Monsters in Society on story worlds and world building, and on the late medieval sagas of Icelanders. And her forthcoming book, Story, World, and Character in the Late, oh boy, Icelandic. So good. Nice. All right. I worked on that for a while with an Icelandic friend, and I still, is probably, and she claims it is one of the nerdiest academic publications in the field of Old Norse, with its references to D&D, Skyrim, Star Trek, and Marvel. So without further ado, I guess we can kick it off for no reason other than it's the list I have here. Tineke, if you don't mind.
Okay, hello everyone. Right, I have prepared some slides, but it currently looks like I'll do without, so because I can't share them easily online with you. That's the one thing that I'm just going to tell everyone, public service announcement. If you want to share slides, test it now, so if you have the desktop Gather app, you give it the right permissions. I can do this without. I'm trained as a teacher. I know how to spin on a dime with tech trouble. I'm going to treat all of you as if you're first-year students in my course and don't have a clue where China even is. So, well, you got to know where China is. But if we think about medieval Chinese monsters, I want to start by questioning everything that's in that title, Medieval Chinese Monsters, because we don't really have a concept of the medieval in China very much. We use dynasties. We've always done that. It's not the most useful way to do things when we try to cross over with other people. So do we think 220 CE to 589 when things unify again? Do we think what's called middle period sometimes from 800 to 1400? None of it is really useful, but if you're a medievalist in Europe and you use about the same time span, it works for me. A lot of the beliefs and the ideas that underlie where monsters and strange creatures come from those ideas go back a lot further. So, and they keep continuing after that specific time period of the medieval is over. So we're good. The concept of China is tricky because there is no such thing as China until 1911, some people say. We have a division between North and South for much of the time period that we would like to call medieval for today's purposes. So what do we call China? Bit of a problem, but again, think of it as much smaller than present-day People's Republic China. Cut off Tibet, cut off a large part of the west, so the Xinjiang area, cut off the northeast, the Manchurian area, and then you're starting to see somewhere where China is. What monsters are, again, that's probably different depending on what definition you start with. If you start from a Western point of view, because we have a very different worldview to work with. The world in China is centered around the emperor or the ruler. That is not unusual. I know there are other cultures that do this. But the interesting thing is that this keeps on going all the way through the documented history. The text that I'm thinking of is called the Tribute of Yu, which is documented in the Book of Documents. Historians date it back to about 300 BCE, but the ideas behind it go back even further. With the emperor at the center, think of it like a campfire. It's nice and warm in the middle of the night when you're close by, but the further away you are, the darker things get, the colder things get, the less you receive the beneficent influence of the emperor, as they think of it. So the less you receive that civilizing influence. And that is why you get monsters and weird creatures on the outskirts of civilization, where the positive influence, that civilizing influence of the emperor doesn't reach. That means also areas where there are mountains, because those are hard to control. Mountains, marshland, and anything that is, frontier regions. A book that really illustrates this very well is the Classic of Mountains and Seas, or the Shanhai Jing in Chinese, sometimes also translated as the Pathways of Mountains and Seas. It is a phenomenal book, and I would highly recommend anyone who's interested in developing games in the Chinese sphere looks very, very closely at this text. It's a guidebook for video games, I think, because it will tell you in this region lives this creature. It has this characteristics. It makes this kind of sound. It eats these things. If you can eat it, it will do these things for your health. So it's almost like telling you how many life points you get. Very often it will eat you. They're very dangerous things because the unknown is dangerous. But this is a guidebook that will help you understand and master these things. It's very often a concept of mastery of the strange, of the unknown. So this is again not unknown. Again, we can look for commonalities here later. It's very much about controlling the unknown by by demonstrating the mastery of something. The interesting thing to me has always been, and this is where I would love to share the pictures with you. I'm going to drop them in the Discord because that's the easiest thing to do, I think. We see complete similarities with earlier or with parallel texts from, for instance, Pliny the Elder, who describes the Blemi, the guys with their face in their chest. The Chinese have the Xingtian, exactly the same kind of description of creature. The Panoti, the long-eared people, Chinese people have the same description of this long-eared group of people. Cyclops, they have it too. So this is a text that really demonstrates how where the good influence of the emperor doesn't reach, it's props up with these weird things. So civilization is a countering influence to the weird. So that's the first place where you find weird stuff. A second place, or a second reason why you might encounter weird stuff in Chinese traditional culture is when there is an imbalance in the force. 5 forces, actually. There are 5 phases in traditional Chinese lore. You've heard of yin and yang, probably. Maybe you've heard of feng shui, geomancy. So the underlying idea there is you have yin and yang need to be in balance. They're never completely fully one or fully the other. They're always sort of changing from one to the other. The 5 phases are similar. Don't think of them as elements where they sort of constitute objects. They sort of cycle through things in a cycle of either conquest or generation. The trick, of course, is to be skilled enough and knowledgeable enough about these things and be able to interpret all of the characteristics that you see around you to know whether a phase is about to generate a new phase or to conquer a new phase. If you've ever seen, what was the film again called? Zhang Yimou's film about the assassin Jinke. The Qin palace is completely in black. That was because the Qin emperor, the first emperor, identified himself with the phase of water, and water is associated with winter, black, darkness, the north, and all of these phases are associated with. Just going to get them straight in front of me so I have them. Always mess them up. So water is in the north, wood is in the east, fire is in the south, metal is in the west, and then the center is earth. So that's the balancing one, and that all is associated with a direction, one of these phases, but also parts of the body, animals, spirit animals, farm animals, useful for sacrifices. And they can overcome each other. So fire, of course, extinguishes water, but so that's conquest. But water can also generate wood because it makes plants grow. So I have a nice image again referring you to the slides, which I'll put in the Discord later. When these things are out of sync, that's when you get trouble. So when phases or when you get imbalances in yin and yang, that's when you start to get things like a cow that has a fifth leg. So whoever it was earlier that was looking for extra legs to do all the jobs they need, have feet in the door in these different subjects, that's where you want to be. You're actually looking for an imbalance in these forces. But the thing is that there also are situations where these imbalances can signify the advent of a new phase. And if you can predict this, if you are skilled at reading these signs, you have an advantage over your competitors. And a skilled reader of these strange signs can predict what's going to happen. Usually the arrival of a new dynasty, the discontent of people that may lead to eventually overthrowing the dynasty. If you can manage that, you can be really useful as an asset to the emperor. And there are special people who learn how to do this. This kind of thinking actually becomes mainstream and becomes accepted by the Confucian scholars who advise the emperor. They even made this a chapter in the official historical document in the standard histories. So imbalances in the forces of nature are another place where you start to see freaks of we think of as freaks of nature, but they find them a normal way. There's just sort of fluctuations in these situations. And the third place where you will find strange things happening and monsters appearing is the dead. That is, again, not unusual in any culture. But the Chinese are quite peculiar because they have a whole system. People are buried with a lot of rituals, and the reason for that is you want to make sure that the dead are buried properly, because there's a whole underworld government and bureaucracy. The Chinese invented bureaucracy, no doubt about it. You needed the right documentation, you needed the right paperwork to demonstrate that you owned the plot of land where you were buried, that the sacrifices were in order, that the soul was released at the right times to go and collect the sacrifices so that they could come and eat. So all of these things were had to be taken care of. If that was not happening, you got unquiet dead people, and they would come and bother the living. And that sort of leaking of the boundary between living and dead is another place where a lot of strange things, phenomena can happen. The tomb then becomes this kind of liminal space where you have one of the souls. There traditionally there's a conception of two souls. You have a Hun soul that leaves the body. The Po soul dwells in the tomb still, and that's the one that will cause a lot of trouble and will ask for things to be put right. For instance, hey, my tomb is leaky, please fix it, or else. In some cases, we can't think, in most cases, we can't think of the dead as just human. They become these spirits, and they may veer off to become demons if they become very, very angry and they get more power because people start trying to placate them and they abuse that power they get. On the other hand, some of the dead, when they start to get power because people try to placate them and try to give them what they want, and if they start to use their power for good, then they can sort of rise up the rankings in the afterworld hierarchy to become a god. And then, of course, on top of that, once Buddhism comes to China, on top of the bureaucracy, you add on Buddhism and the ideas of Buddhist hell, and you get essentially bureaucratic hell. Is the best way I can describe it. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this. Other people have written about this. I'm happy to guide you around in Buddhist hell if you want to tour. But what we know about it, according to the Chinese, comes from people who've returned, from people who hold jobs in both governments. So there's the whole bureaucracy of the underworld, but sometimes it's run by people who also have jobs still in the world of living. It's very interesting stories that come from there. So what in fact is a monster then, if the Chinese are thinking about it? They don't think about it as a monster in the way as something that's out there and abhorrent. It's something that they don't necessarily understand, but it's seen as a part of this world. It's not supernatural. It's part very much of this world, even if it is something that comes back from the dead. It is always something that defies order or government, which are the same word in Chinese, true. And it's something that ultimately can be explained, it can be named, and occasionally it can be tamed. It's kind of the attitude that officials will have to this, because the government's tasked to then put these things in their place. The attitude they will have is join us or submit to us, or else we will destroy you. And that collaboration is really interesting to me. They have this attitude towards monsters and strange things, but of course, they also have this towards foreigners who also live beyond the pale and beyond the reach of the civilization that the emperor radiates from the center where he lives. So that's all I have as opening remarks on where the Chinese and their monsters come from.
Great, thank you. And I guess we just go straight into Rebecca, and then we can kick off the questioning and discussion once you've both spoken.
All right, I'm going to try and share my screen. I don't know if it will work. Please let me know in a moment if you can see this. Can you see the slides? Can someone just please unmute themselves and tell me if
Yes.
you can see the slides? Fantastic. Oh my God, this is brilliant. Thank you so much. Cool. So first of all, quick content warning. I'm going to be talking about sexualized violence in a little bit because of the sort of historical specificity of Icelandic monsters. If that's a lot for you, then just drop out for a second. That's perfectly fine. We can talk about other things later on as well. The way that I've approached this is sort of as a more sort of methodological talk. How do we go about finding monsters in medieval Icelandic literature? Because I thought we can then talk about sort of specific examples a little bit later, if that's of interest, depending on what people are interested in. The undead would be one topic that obviously Tineke and I both, or both Chinese literature that she was talking about, or sources that she was talking about, and Icelandic literature that I'm going to be talking about have in common. So there will be a link there, but we'll see how it goes. When we talk about medieval Icelandic literature, we have a bunch of different genres to look at, and a bunch of different types of writing to consider. So we have poetic sources, we have mythological sources, we have historiographical sources, and we have saga literature. And what I mostly work on is saga literature, which is it comes from the word saga comes from the verb að segja in Icelandic, to say or to narrate, to tell a story. So they're narrative texts, some of them prosaimetric, so some of them are prose and then include verse as well, some of them just prose, but narrative texts that talk about various different things. But we could also talk about mythology, for example, because obviously we have the giants in there as well. Are they monstrous? That is definitely something to consider. And then sometimes we find paranormal things even in, let's say, Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, or the Annals. So there's a lot of, there's paranormal and monstrous stuff pretty much all across the medieval Icelandic corpus. Saga literature itself falls into a number of different sort of subcategories or genres. We have stories about Norwegian kings, we have stories about medieval Icelanders in different ages. So the sagas of Icelanders are sort of set from sort of the 9th to mid 11th century, and then the contemporary sagas, or Sturlunga saga, sort of picks up in sort of the 12th century, and then goes to sort of the mid to late 13th. Bishop sagas, similar time frame as the contemporary sagas. Saints' lives can be about medieval Icelandic saints, can be about saints that we have in other countries as well. And the Fatnaðarssögur, or the legendary sagas, sagas of old times, are generally set before the settlement of Iceland, which we assume was around 870. And then we have the chivalric sagas, again, different groups, translated sagas that are adapted from French, Anglo-Norman and German sources, or then an indigenous tradition of chivalric sagas that combine sort of elements and motifs of the chivalric tradition, or feudal tradition rather, from the continent, with sort of native storytelling traditions. What I'm going to be talking about mostly are the sagas of Icelanders, or Íslendingasögur, because that's what most of my work has focused on in the past. They are the best researched, probably, of all of these different subgroups, but we're also going to be talking a little bit about the legendary sagas, perhaps, because there's a lot of overlap when it comes to the depiction of the paranormal and the monstrous in these two groups. So sagas of Iceland is, again, sort of set from the mid-9th to the mid-11th century, mostly in Iceland, but we also have bits in Norway, in Greenland, in Vinland. So when we go to the discovery of North America, in the British Isles and the Baltic. So lots of traveling around happening there as well. And obviously on those voyages, sometimes you encounter the monstrous. Sometimes it's also in Iceland. How do we go about finding monsters in the Íslendingasögur? What do we even consider monsters? I mean, that's always the question, right? Do we go looking for monstra of the sort of Plinian learned variety, the Plinian races? If we do that, then we're going to be more or less disappointed relatively soon, because we're only going to find one so-called einfætingur, a uniped. This is from a French manuscript. And we're going to find him in Eirik Saga Rauða, which is one of those sagas that do tell about the settlement of, or the attempt at settling in North America. And interestingly, that this einfætingur appears as an omen, as monsters often do, which portends that the Norse are going to be unsuccessful at settling in the New World, because the land is rich, but it's also very destructive, and there's going to be conflict with the native inhabitants there. So the Norse settlers are going to be unsuccessful there. So we're not going to find a lot of those types of monsters in the Íslendingasögur. What else can we do? We can start looking for indigenous terms for monster. And one of the terms that we can look at is the word tröll, or tröll. Both spellings appear. Tröll is the more modern spelling, and the one that I tend to use more. But the problem is then, what does tröll, troll, what does that even mean? Does it just mean troll? Do we understand what it means? No, we do not. Ármann Jakobsson, an Icelandic scholar of various monstrous and outcast things in the sagas, has sort of observed which kind of creatures are labeled tröll in the sources, and he writes: a troll may be a giant or mountain dweller, a witch, an abnormally strong or large or ugly person, an evil spirit, a ghost, a blaumaur, so a black man, literally, and sort of racialized monster, a magical boar, a heathen demigod, a demon, a brunmi, which is a weird sort of folkloric creature, or a berserk. So these are 13 different kinds of beings that are all labeled tröll in medieval Icelandic, and that doesn't really tell us much. John Lindo says that this semantic breadth adds to the problem of determining the etymology or even the primary meaning of troll, but it is emblematic of trolls. They are shifting and changing, hard to pin down in the end, except perhaps by what they are not: human, normal, or helpful. And this is then what people have tried to do, sort of figure out what a troll is through what a troll is not, but that also doesn't quite work. For example, trolls, especially the Folknerasse, the legendary sagas, are often very helpful. For example, troll women interacting with the male heroes can be very helpful in a sexual way indeed. So they're not human and they're not normal, but sometimes they can be helpful as helper figures or as sexual partners for the male heroes in those stories. So again, this doesn't quite work. So trolls are very monstrous in that we don't really know what they are and we can't pin them down to one category or thing. So what do we do if we can't find the learned variety of monsters? We don't really know what the indigenous terminology means. So what other options do we have? And this is where Simon Mittman's approach comes in quite handy, because he says that a monster is not really known for observation. How could it be? How could the viewer distinguish between normally terrifying phenomena and abnormally terrifying monstrosity? And this is obviously even more problematic when we look back at a different culture from the past. Sort of, the texts were written from the 13th, 14th century onwards. So there's 700 or 800 years separating us from that past. How can we observe monstrosity? And he suggests, rather, I submit, the monster is known for its effect, or its impact. So I took this to heart, and I tried to, look at which kinds of truck we can see interacting with other people around them, humans and otherwise. And I, for my PhD, which was published as Monsters in Society, as Liam mentioned earlier, I basically substituted the word monster for the human or formerly human kinds of threat. So revenants, the undead, berserks, so people who have the ability to go into this sort of battle rage, magic users who can perform magic to alter the environment mostly, and outlaws. Outlaws obviously are outcast by society. They often are the same as what Alderman says, the abnormally strong or larger ugly persons. They often tend to be or become outlaws in the stories. So I looked at those categories of characters or beings really, and considered how they behaved and how they interacted with people around them. And then 3 aspects emerged as central in that interaction. One is transgression. Either physical laws, for example, when people are undead, obviously they transgress the physical law. That means, we live and then we die and then that's it. For revenants, that's not it. Or of social norms, for example, if you murder someone, or if you sexually assault someone, or if you use magic, especially if you use it in secret. Murder in a medieval Icelandic context is also done in secret, and this is very important, distinguishing it from manslaughter or other types of killing, where you basically announce that you just killed someone and then you pay compensation. It's sort of supposedly fine. If you murder someone, it's done in secret, and you don't tell anyone about it. Similar with magic, you can perform that in secret, and that's sort of the problematic aspect of it. The second aspect that emerged from the observation of interaction is contagion. For example, revenants infect other people with revenancy. People who they kill tend to then also start haunting. Berserks, if they sexually assault women, they tend to father berserk children on these women, which is very problematic because these children are then raised as members of society. And then the third aspect that I was looking at is the economic impact that these creatures have on society. So they go around killing people or livestock, which in a farming society obviously is very problematic. With revenants, sometimes we hear that social functioning in a particular area is no longer possible. People can't sort of travel around to exchange news or goods or just talk to one another. So this is very problematic in the kind of society that's depicted in this the literature. And taken together, I labeled this social monstrosity because the physical aspect, while it does appear, especially with revenants and berserks, is less central to the depiction in the Íslendingasögur than this aspect of social interaction and disruption is. More recently, I've then also, in my work on the late Íslendingasögur, the new book that's coming out in June, I've also looked at the sort of mountain dwelling variety of tröll, so the kinds of creatures that we nowadays would probably recognize as trolls from pop culture, from movies. And these only appear in the post-classical Íslendingasögur, so late Íslendingasögur written in the 14th and 15th centuries, as well as in then other genres, the legendary sagas, Fornaldarsögur and the chivalric sagas, or sagas of knights, Riddarasögur. And they show us that, especially in late medieval Icelandic literature, we have this strong interest in non-human outsiders, because trolls obviously are co-specific. They can recreate, they can reproduce with humans, but they are not humans. They are different kind of species, and certain stories can only be told through the inclusion of these kinds of characters. One example of this that I already hinted at is a story pattern that we see a lot in the Fornaldarsögur, which is a love affair between a human hero and a troll woman or giantess, and this frequently results in offspring that is then obviously half troll, half human. And what do you do with that offspring? Can you integrate it into society? Do you even show interest in it? If it's a girl, usually not that interesting. If it's a boy, very interesting for the narrative. So that brings with it a host of new narrative possibilities, as well as cultural possibilities. And that sort of brings us to my final section. When we look at monster theory, especially Cohen's obviously seminal article on monsters, Cohen and then also Mushabash, who I'm also citing here, point out that monsters are culturally specific. They operate within a specific cultural context, they arise from that cultural context, and they signify anxieties, concerns within this specific cultural context. So if we want to understand the monsters of the Íslendingasögur, we have to look at Icelandic society in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, and then maybe also going forward, because these stories were transmitted across the centuries. We have manuscripts all the way up to the early 20th century containing these sagas. So one thing that we then have to do is look at who produced these texts. And we know that the sagas were produced for the medieval Icelandic elite and by the medieval Icelandic elite. They are the ones whose concerns are mostly shared or reflected in these sources, and on whose interests and whose ideologies these sagas then also reinforce. One example that we can look at is the prevalence of sort of hyper-masculine monsters like berserks or male trolls attacking women, sexually attacking women, and thereby also dishonoring the men of their families. And this, I have argued, reflects anxieties around losing control over female sexuality, but also obviously over outsiders threatening Icelandic society that are coming in from the outside, like Norwegians settling in Iceland or trying to assume specific posts in medieval Icelandic government or governance, ultimately in the later medieval period. And these anxieties coincide with the need of the Icelandic elite to create an ideology that separates them from other social groups. So with various shifts in the legal context in late medieval Iceland, this assumed great importance for this group of basically Icelandic sort of farming magnates or wannabe aristocrats ultimately, who wanted to sort of cohere as a group, as an elite group in society, and part of their ideology became this reflection on sexuality ultimately. At the same time as we have hyper-masculine monsters attacking women, we also have troll women being sexualized, and then there are also transgressive women, for example, maiden kings in the legendary sagas, chivalric sagas, who transgress the limits of femininity ultimately by assuming rule in their own name. A lot of these women are sexually shamed into submission, so by sexually assaulting them. And these rape fantasies, as Johanna Katrin Friðriksdóttir, for example, has argued, work basically as propaganda tools to keep women in line. And this sort of confirms again what Cohen writes about the monster as something that prevents mobility, intellectual, geographic, or in this case, sexual mobility, delimiting the social spaces through which private bodies may move. And if you step outside societal norms of, in this case, sexual behavior, you risk potentially becoming monstrous yourself. So as conservative tools of the Icelandic elite, monsters of Old Icelandic saga literature, in my opinion, embody the fears and desires current in a changing society in late 13th and 14th century Iceland. We can talk about that more afterwards. Thank you. I'm going to see how I can get out of the screen share again. I don't know how to do that. Like this. Cool.
Great. Thank you so much. That was also excellent. And it appears that our final panelist has indeed arrived. I think so. So Rakesh Khanna grew up in Berkeley, California, of mixed Punjabi and Anglo-American heritage. He is the co-founder of Black Publications in Chennai, with his wife Rashmi Ruth Devadasan, in which he founded in 2008 with her. And the company publishes translations of best-selling Indian language pulp fiction, folklore, and graphic novels. He's the co-author with Jay Fursifer Bhairav of Ghosts, Monsters, and Demons of India. So he brings a third geographical region to this whole shindig.
So my background was not in any of these things. I got into it much later. I started translating pulp fiction from Indian languages and working on publishing Indian folklore. So I got into this kind of late career. So I compiled a book called Ghosts, Monsters, and Demons of India, which is about mythological creatures and demons and otherworld beings from all over the country. In terms of medieval monsters, like the medieval period is not so well defined in India, right? But I guess one thing that I would want to say is that the modern Hindu nationalist movement is trying really hard to sort of paint all of the medieval period or India's deep past as very Hindu, and I think that's sort of a mistake. Like, it's always been very pluralistic. There's been the Buddhist canon and the Jain canon, and Hinduism itself wasn't really one religion back then. There were lots of different traditions in different areas and in different ethno-linguistic groups. So I guess what I was trying to do in my book is bring out a lot of those supernatural creature traditions, which are maybe getting steamrolled a little bit by the mainstream Hindu take on Rakshasas. In modern Hindi myths, everything becomes a Rakshasa. But if you go back, into deeper tribal folklore or folklore from different languages, you get many different kinds of monsters. And some of my favorites, and a lot of the book, are monsters from the northeast of the country, which are less spoken about. Those 7 states over sort of nestled between Myanmar and Bangladesh, which have a really wonderful tradition of giant man-eating serpents and all kinds of hidden folk. So I think I would just say it's very deep and very pluralistic, and there are a lot of different traditions that don't really fit into the mainstream Hindu narrative of what a monster is or what demons are. So, could talk some more.
Whatever you'd like. If you want to talk more, go for it. Otherwise, we can open it up to chit chat.
Right. Yeah, I didn't hear at the beginning if you talked much about how you define medieval, but there's not great records for a lot of things, right? There's the ancient epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which have come down through oral tradition and were written down maybe 2,000 years ago. That that's more ancient than medieval. If you come to medieval times in North India, it's around the time when you had Muslim armies invading, and then there were different Muslim sultanates battling each other. There's a really interesting report from Ibn Battuta, the traveler. I think he was from Morocco, right? Who came to India in I want to say the 12th century, about witches and folkloric monsters in Delhi. So there's there's interesting stuff written about that. And from South India, you have the Pei, which is sort of like a ghost, but not always the ghost of a dead person. They can just be sort of evil spirits. There's the Pisacha, which is maybe a term which is just applied to any tribes that ate human flesh as part of some ritual, but then it sort of became this mythologized, sex-hungry, really cruel demon. So Pisachas are almost pan-Indian, but they show up in different ways in different places. And there are very many of them. They're very numerous, and they're gregarious. There could be armies of hundreds of thousands of Pisachas. So Rakshasas, Pisachas, Pretas are like the hungry ghosts from Buddhist myth, and more familiar from like the Chinese ghost festival. That's the Buddhist canon ghost. Yeah, and then if you go back further, there's all these there were actually dragons, something like dragons in the Himalayas. Theseus, who's the ancient, he was the Greek writer who was based in Persepolis, who wrote about, he had like Indian envoys coming to Persepolis, so he was reporting to Europe about what he heard about the Indian subcontinent. So that's where we get manticores and unicorns and all this stuff. But he wrote about Indian dragons. So the Indian dragons didn't have wings. They would like curl up into trees and eat elephants. And that they also had this jewel, the magic jewel in their heads. Indian dragons, are famous for having this hardened magic jewel, which is very similar to the more modern Naga myth. You have this idea of like the 100-year-old cobra. If a cobra lives for 100 years and doesn't ever bite anybody, then the venom hardens in its head and becomes this magic Nagamani. So those magic jewels are the sort of the MacGuffin of a lot of Indian pulp stories. Sorcerers are fighting to try to get the Nagamani. So yeah, the Nagas are a whole other supernatural race. The Yakshis, which are maybe a little bit more like elves or fairies, they started out kind of, Yakshas and Yakshis sort of started out like dryads, I want to say like nature spirits associated with trees. And these are really, really old, like they show up in some of the oldest sculptures in India are of Yakshas. But in more modern times, especially in the South, Yakshis are more like succubi, like vampire spirits that you don't want to meet on a lonely road at night. So, yeah.
Right. Awesome. Yeah, thank you. We're getting some questions in the chat.